Picture this: waking up each morning, not knowing where the next meal might come from. Your entire existence tied to the migration of animals, the ripening of wild grains, the turning of the seasons. There were no permanent homes, no stocked pantries, no written laws to rely on. Life was an unscripted dance with nature, both beautiful and brutally demanding. This was the world of our earliest ancestors, a world defined by motion, adaptation, and deep connection to the land. For tens of thousands of years, humanity lived this way, small groups moving across vast landscapes, their lives shaped by the immediate need to survive. And yet, somehow, from these fluid and often fragile beginnings, arose civilizations of staggering scale and sophistication, empires that built monumental cities, codified laws, forged armies, and created art that still takes our breath away. How did this happen? What compelled humans to exchange the freedom of the open horizon for the walls of a city, the intimacy of a tribal fire for the grandeur of a palace? This is one of history's most profound mysteries, and it's a story that belongs to all of us. This great transition from nomads to empire didn't just change where people lived, it transformed what it meant to be human. It redefined community, power, creativity, and belief. It gave us writing and wheeled carts, temples and tax collectors, kings and slaves. It laid the groundwork for the world we know today, from the languages we speak to the foods we eat, the governments we live under to the stories we tell. In this video, we're going to trace that extraordinary journey, unpacking the forces, environmental, technological, social, and spiritual, that made it possible. We'll explore why some groups chose to settle down while others held onto nomadic traditions, how early villages grew into bustling cities, and what it took to weave together diverse peoples into a single, cohesive identity. This isn't just a story about the past, it's about the foundations of modern society. It's about us, so come with us on this journey back through time, to an era of immense change and even greater imagination. We'll walk with hunters and herders as they faced a shifting climate, stand beside the first farmers as they nurtured seeds into surplus, and witness the birth of writing, law, and faith that would bind millions together. By the end, you'll see this ancient shift not as some distant historical event, but as a living legacy, one that echoes in our neighborhoods, our nations, and our dreams. This is the story of how humanity traded wandering for wonder, mobility for majesty, and in doing so, built the world as we know it. Let's begin. To truly grasp the scale of this transformation, we need to step into the minds and lives of our nomadic ancestors. Their world was not one of lack, but of a different kind of abundance, an intimate, hard-won knowledge of the Earth's rhythms. These societies were the ultimate specialists in adaptability, their entire existence fine-tuned to the subtle cues of the natural world. Their calendar was not marked on stone or parchment, but in the movement of herds, the budding of certain plants, and the angle of the sun. Survival depended on a fluid, collective intelligence, a shared understanding passed not through written decrees but through generations of lived experience. Their social fabric was woven from necessity and mutual dependence. Leadership was often situational. The best hunter might guide a pursuit, the most experienced elder might resolve a dispute, and the most knowledgeable forager might decide the direction of the next move. This created a remarkably egalitarian structure compared to what would follow. Possessions were few and purposeful, lightweight, multi-purpose tools carved from bone, stone, and wood, shelters made from animal hides, wooden poles, and whatever the local environment provided, designed to be assembled and disassembled with efficiency. This material simplicity, however, belied a profound cultural richness. Their history, law, and spiritual beliefs were held in the collective memory, shared and kept alive through stories told under the stars, through songs that mapped the landscape, and through rituals that honored the animals and forces that sustained them. This constant movement was not aimless wandering. It was a strategic and deeply intelligent circulation within a vast, familiar territory. It was a life that cultivated incredible resilience, problem-solving skills, and innovation. Early nomads were brilliant inventors, devising sophisticated traps, mastering the properties of different stones for toolmaking, and later, learning to control fire, a technology that revolutionized their ability to cook food, ward off predators, and survive in colder climates. They possessed a dynamic and ever-evolving knowledge base, constantly experimenting and adapting their techniques to new challenges and environments. Yet, for all its strengths, this way of life operated within strict natural limits. Population size was constrained by the carrying capacity of the land. A prolonged drought, a harsh winter, or the unexpected migration of a key prey species could bring a community to the brink of catastrophe. There was little room for surplus, and therefore little opportunity for the kind of specialized labor that builds permanent monuments or complex institutions. Knowledge was vast but vulnerable, stored only in human memory. The very flexibility that was their greatest strength also meant a lack of accumulation, of food, of people, and of physical infrastructure. This delicate balance, this beautiful but precarious dance with nature, set the stage for a momentous decision. When the environment itself began to shift, these master adapters were faced with a new, unprecedented challenge, one that would eventually lead them to consider a radical new way of living. But this finely tuned way of life, so perfectly adapted to its environment, was about to be profoundly disrupted. The world itself began to change in ways that would challenge the very foundations of nomadic existence. The end of the last ice age, a gradual warming trend that began around 12,000 years ago, didn't just melt glaciers, it redrew the map of human possibility. Vast ice sheets retreated, sea levels rose, and entirely new ecosystems emerged where tundra and steppe had once dominated. For generations of people who had learned to read the land like a familiar story, the pages of that story were suddenly being rewritten. In some regions, this climatic shift was a disaster. Traditional migratory routes that had been reliable for centuries now led to barren lands or disappeared under rising waters. The great herds of animals that nomads depended on shifted their patterns or dwindled in number, their movements now unpredictable. A way of life built on knowing exactly where and when to find resources was suddenly plunged into uncertainty. This wasn't a temporary hardship, it was a fundamental rupture in the contract between humanity and nature. The old strategies were no longer guaranteed to work, and the risks of constant movement, of arriving at a familiar watering hole only to find it dry, or a seasonal hunting ground empty, grew exponentially. Yet, in other parts of the world, this same global warming created opportunities of staggering potential. One region in particular, a sweeping arc of land known as the Fertile Crescent, blossomed into a paradise of natural abundance. Stretching from the Nile Valley through the Levant and down into the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, this area saw the emergence of wild grains like wheat and barley in incredible density. It was also home to animals ideally suited to domestication: goats, sheep, and cattle. For the nomadic groups who moved through this region, the equation began to shift. Why follow a herd for months when you could encourage them to stay near a reliable water source? Why spend days foraging for scattered wild grains when you could tend to a dense patch right here? This environmental change also intersected with another slow-burning development: gradual population growth. over millennia, successful nomadic bands grew in size. More people meant more mouths to feed, which in turn put greater pressure on the local resources within their vast territories. The logic of nomadism relies on a low population density. Too many people moving through an area too quickly can deplete the very resources they depend on. Some groups may have responded to this pressure with conflict, clashing with neighboring bands over access to prime hunting grounds or watering holes. But others responded with a spark of innovation, a willingness to experiment. They began to intervene in nature's processes, not just harvest from them. They might have noticed that grains they gathered and accidentally spilled near a campsite would sprout the following year, creating a convenient new patch. They might have started corralling young animals instead of hunting them all, recognizing their value as a living larder. This combination of push and pull factors created a powerful tipping point. The push came from the increasing difficulty and risk of the nomadic lifestyle in a changing world. The pull came from the tantalizing possibility of a more secure and controllable food supply in certain lucky regions. The calculus of survival was being rewritten. The immense energy expenditure of constant movement, with its inherent dangers and uncertainties, began to look less appealing than the hard but predictable work of tending a field or managing a herd in one place. This was the moment humanity faced a monumental choice: continue a life of motion that had defined our species for millennia, or take a gamble on a new, stationary existence. It was a decision forced upon us by a changing climate, but it would be realized through human curiosity, observation, and a bold leap into the unknown. The stage was now set for the single greatest revolution in human history, and so the stage was set for humanity's greatest gamble. This was not a sudden invention like flipping a switch. It was a slow, hesitant dance with nature that unfolded over generations. Picture a small band of people in the Fertile Crescent, perhaps returning to the same valley season after season. They might have begun by simply encouraging the growth of wild stands of wheat, clearing away competing plants. They might have started to corral a few wild goats, not as a planned livestock operation, but as a way to keep a convenient food source nearby for a little while longer. These weren't grand decisions to become farmers. They were small, practical adjustments to a changing world, but each adjustment pulled them just a little further away from the old rhythms of the hunt and the gathering circuit. They were putting down roots both literally and figuratively. The true game changer in this process was the deliberate act of selection. Early cultivators, through simple observation, began to favor certain plants over others. They would naturally collect seeds from the wheat stalks that didn't shatter easily, or from the barley that had the largest grains. When they planted these selected seeds the next season, they were unknowingly directing the evolution of these plants, breeding them to be more dependent on human intervention and more productive. The same process happened with animals. The most aggressive goats might be culled, while the more docile ones that produced more milk were kept and bred. This was the birth of domestication, a new partnership between humans and other species. It was a contract. We provide protection and guaranteed food. You provide a predictable, abundant yield. This partnership unlocked a power our ancestors had never known before, the power to create a food surplus. The impact of that surplus cannot be overstated. For the first time in human history, not every single member of the community had to be directly involved in the daily quest for food. This simple fact shattered the old social order and built a new one from the ground up. With a steady, stored food supply, a village could support people who specialized in other tasks. Someone could now dedicate their life to perfecting the art of making pottery, creating sturdy vessels to store that precious grain surplus. Another could become a full-time toolmaker, experimenting with new techniques to create sharper sickle blades for harvesting or stronger axes for clearing land. Others might focus on weaving, construction, or even organizing communal labor for building irrigation ditches. This division of labor was a social earthquake. It created new social classes, the artisans, the administrators, and eventually, the ruling elites who managed the surplus and the growing community. This new way of life left a permanent mark on the landscape. Temporary camps gave way to permanent villages, often located near the best fields or water sources. These weren't just clusters of huts, they were statements of permanence. We see the archaeological evidence in the form of mud brick houses with stone foundations, communal storage pits lined with plaster, and the first signs of communal projects, perhaps a simple wall for defense against rival groups or wandering bands who still lived the old way. The very architecture reflected a new mindset, investment in a specific place. People were building for the future, for their children and their children's children. They were creating a home in a way that was simply unimaginable in a nomadic existence. Yet, it is crucial to remember that this Neolithic revolution was not a uniform event that swept across the globe all at once. It was a mosaic of experimentation and adaptation. In some regions, like the hills of the Fertile Crescent, the transition was relatively swift because the wild ancestors of wheat and barley were abundant. In other places, like the Americas, it happened independently but with entirely different crops like maize and potatoes, and followed a much slower timeline. Many groups practiced a mixed economy for centuries, perhaps settling down for part of the year to tend a small crop, and then returning to hunting and gathering for the rest. This revolution was also not an unequivocal improvement in quality of life. Early farmers often had a less varied and nutritious diet than their foraging counterparts, and the close proximity to animals and waste led to new infectious diseases. Life became more secure in terms of famine risk, but also more crowded, more stratified, and more prone to new kinds of social conflict. The decision to farm was a trade-off, a bargain with the future that brought both incredible power and new, complex challenges. It was a cultural reorientation that shifted humanity's focus from what could be found to what could be produced, from living within nature's limits to beginning to reshape those limits themselves. Imagine the profound psychological shift that must have occurred when a family, for the first time, could point to a specific patch of land and say, "This is ours." This was perhaps the most revolutionary social consequence of settled life, the birth of private property. For nomads, the concept of owning land was as foreign as owning the wind or the rain. Territory was shared, a vast commons to be used by the group and then left behind. But with agriculture, everything changed. The investment of backbreaking labor clearing fields, planting seeds, tending crops, created a powerful, tangible connection to a specific plot of earth. It was no longer just part of the landscape, it was an extension of the self, of the family's sweat and future security. This land could be improved, passed down to children, and defended against others. And with that simple, possessive act, the genie of inequality was let out of the bottle. This new concept of ownership inevitably created winners and losers. A family with a prime plot of land near a reliable water source, blessed with good fortune and strong laborers, could consistently produce a larger surplus than their neighbors. They could trade this surplus for better tools, more livestock, or the labor of others. Over generations, these small advantages compounded. Wealth, for the first time, wasn't just about personal skill or charisma. It became a heritable, tangible thing. A prosperous farmer could leave his son not just knowledge, but warehouses of grain, herds of cattle, and tracts of fertile land. Meanwhile, a family struck by drought, illness, or simply poorer land would have less. To survive, they might have to borrow from their wealthy neighbor, incurring debts that could eventually force them to work that neighbor's fields, effectively becoming the first class of dependent laborers. The egalitarian fabric of the nomadic band, where resources were generally shared, began to fray, replaced by a new social hierarchy with a propertied elite at the top and a landless underclass at the bottom. As villages swelled from dozens to hundreds of inhabitants, this new complexity demanded new forms of organization. The informal, consensus-based leadership that worked for a small, mobile group simply couldn't manage the disputes that now arose. Arguments over water rights, field boundaries, and inheritance required impartial judgment. Coordinating the construction of a communal granary or a defensive palisade needed a clear voice of authority. Protecting the accumulated wealth of the village from envious outsiders required not just brave individuals, but an organized militia. Out of these practical necessities, formal leadership emerged. Respected elders or successful warriors evolved into chieftains or headmen. Their authority, which might have been temporary for a specific hunt or raid, began to solidify into a permanent position. They were the arbiters of justice, the organizers of community projects, and the commanders of defense. This was the slow, organic birth of government, a social tool for managing the friction and scale that sedentary life itself had created. This stability also unleashed a creative explosion unlike anything humanity had experienced before. When your entire world isn't packed on your back, you can finally start to accumulate things. Pottery, once a fragile luxury for nomads, became a cornerstone of settled life. Sturdy jars for storing grain, pots for cooking, and bowls for serving. Artisans could now dedicate themselves to perfecting their craft, creating not just functional items but objects of beauty and status. A finely painted pot or an intricately carved tool was no longer just a tool, it was a symbol. It could signify a family's wealth, a person's role in society, or membership in a particular group. These material possessions became anchors for cultural identity, physical manifestations of a shared history and set of values that were now tied to a place, not just a people. All of these changes, property, hierarchy, governance, and material culture, fed into a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle. Stability from agriculture allowed the population to grow. A larger population produced more surplus and more complexity. More complexity required stronger, more centralized leadership. This leadership could then organize labor to create even greater stability and surplus, for example by building irrigation systems that boosted crop yields, which supported an even larger population. This virtuous or perhaps vicious cycle was the engine of social evolution. Each turn of the wheel pulled society further away from its nomadic roots and closer to something entirely new, a proto-state, a society on the cusp of civilization, where the bonds of kinship were being supplemented and sometimes supplanted by the bonds of law, loyalty, and class. The individual was becoming a citizen, and the band was transforming into a body politic. But this new social complexity, this growing web of relationships and hierarchies, demanded more than just strong leadership and shared beliefs. It demanded tools. The ambitions of these early settled societies were quickly outpacing what human muscle and memory alone could achieve. To manage surplus, to organize labor, to defend territory, and to communicate across distances, humanity needed to extend its reach. And so began an era of breathtaking invention, a period where human ingenuity began to build the very foundations of empire, one technological breakthrough at a time. Consider something as seemingly simple as a clay pot. For nomads, pottery was often too heavy and fragile to be practical, but for a settled community, it was nothing short of a revolution in a bowl. The ability to shape clay and fire it into a hard, waterproof container transformed how people interacted with their most basic resource, food. Suddenly, grain could be stored for months, even years, protected from moisture, rodents, and rot. This didn't just mitigate the risk of a bad harvest, it fundamentally changed the economy of survival. A surplus was no longer an abstract concept, it was a physical reality, sitting in a row of sturdy jars in a communal storeroom. This security allowed populations to grow even further. Pottery also revolutionized cooking, enabling new methods like boiling, which made food safer and more digestible, and it became the first true medium for long-distance trade. A beautifully decorated pot holding valuable oil or grain could be transported and traded, carrying both calories and culture to new regions. Yet, to clear more land for farming and to shape the world around them, people needed tools stronger than stone or wood. This need sparked humanity's fiery romance with metal. It likely began by accident, perhaps with someone noticing that a certain greenish rock, a copper ore, would melt in a hot campfire and then harden into a malleable lump. This discovery of smelting was a monumental leap. Early metallurgists learned to build specialized furnaces to achieve higher temperatures, to mix ores to create tougher alloys like bronze, and to pour the molten metal into molds. The impact was immediate and profound. A bronze axe could clear a forest far more efficiently than a stone one. A bronze-tipped plow could cut deeper into the soil, opening up new land for cultivation and dramatically boosting crop yields. And of course, these durable, sharp, and reliable metals were swiftly adapted for warfare, creating weapons that were deadlier and armor that offered better protection, giving organized armies a decisive advantage over less equipped rivals. The age of metal had begun, and with it came the power to reshape the physical world with unprecedented force. But to feed the growing cities that this new technology supported, farming had to become more reliable than the whims of the weather. In the great river valleys where empires first took root, like those of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile, the answer was irrigation. This was technology on a grand communal scale. It required a vision that looked beyond a single field or season, and the organized labor of hundreds of people working in concert. Canals were dug to divert river water to fields far from the bank. Dams and levees were constructed to control flooding and store water. Shaddaf's simple counterweight lifts and later, more complex water wheels were invented to raise water from canals into fields. These irrigation systems turned arid, sun-baked land into perpetually fertile green belts. They broke humanity's dependency on seasonal rainfall, creating a predictable agricultural engine that could support immense, non-farming populations of soldiers, priests, artisans, and administrators. The management of these water systems became one of the first and most important functions of central authority, a practical reason for people to cede power to a ruling class that could coordinate such a vital resource. Perhaps the most transformative innovation of all was one that began not on the battlefield or the field, but in the accounting office. As temples and palaces managed ever larger stores of grain, herds of cattle, and tracts of land, the human memory became an insufficient ledger. The earliest writing systems, like cuneiform in Mesopotamia, emerged directly from this need for record-keeping. The first texts weren't poetry or history, they were inventory lists. 2 sheep delivered by farmer X, 5 jars of oil in storage room Y. To do this, scribes used a stylus to press pictographs into wet clay tablets. Over time, these pictures became more abstract, evolving into a flexible system of symbols that could represent not just objects, but also sounds and ideas. This was a revolution in information technology. For the first time, knowledge could be stored outside the human brain. A command from a ruler could be sent to a distant governor and remain perfectly intact. Laws could be written down and displayed publicly, creating a standard of justice that was less arbitrary. Complex astronomical observations could be recorded and passed down, leading to accurate calendars that told farmers exactly when to plant. Writing froze thought in time, allowing knowledge to accumulate across generations instead of being lost with the death of each elder. It became the ultimate tool of administration, the glue that could hold a vast and diverse empire together by ensuring everyone was working from the same set of instructions. Each of these technologies, pottery, metallurgy, irrigation, and writing, did not exist in isolation. They fed into each other in a powerful cascade of progress. Better metal tools meant more efficient digging of irrigation canals. Improved irrigation produced larger surpluses that needed to be recorded with more sophisticated writing. The administrative class literate in writing could then better organize the miners and smiths to produce more metal. This virtuous cycle of innovation amplified human capability exponentially. What was once a scattered collection of villages could now coordinate the labor and resources of an entire region. They could build monumental structures, field large standing armies, and manage complex economies. Technology provided the physical means to turn the cultural dream of permanence and power into a tangible, functioning reality. It was the toolbox that built the first empires, providing the leverage humanity needed to lift itself from humble villages to the dazzling heights of ancient civilization. These burgeoning cities, with their specialized artisans and growing appetites for resources, could no longer rely solely on their immediate surroundings. They needed things that their local environment couldn't provide. The finest timber for a temple's roof beams might only be found in distant mountains. The most prized stones for a king's seal came from quarries hundreds of miles away. This hunger for exotic materials, for luxury and for necessity, gave birth to the world's first great trade networks. These weren't just simple paths for barter. They were the ancient world's information superhighways, pulsing with the movement of goods, people, and, most importantly, ideas. Picture a merchant caravan slowly making its way across the arid landscape of the Middle East. The donkeys are laden not just with sacks of grain or bolts of cloth, but with something far more transformative: knowledge. A merchant from the city of skilled in the art of copper alloying, might share a technique for making stronger tools with a smith in a small Anatolian village. In return, that village smith might show him a new, more efficient design for a furnace. These traders became the unsung heroes of cultural diffusion, accidental ambassadors who carried the seeds of innovation in their packs. They didn't just move products, they moved practical know-how. A new design for a potter's wheel, a more effective way to harness an ox to a plow, a revolutionary method for building a corbelled arch. These ideas hitched a ride on the backs of camels and the hulls of ships, spreading from one culture to another at the speed of commerce. The objects themselves told stories of distant lands and different ways of life. A piece of finely woven linen from Egypt, found in a Mesopotamian tomb, spoke of a society with highly skilled weavers and a hot climate. A necklace of Baltic amber discovered in a Mycenaean palace whispered of vast, cold northern forests and the long, daring journey it had taken, but the exchange went far deeper than material goods. A merchant settling his accounts in a foreign port might introduce the concept of standardized weights, a system that would eventually evolve into local currency. A sailor describing the sophisticated lateen sails used on Egyptian boats could inspire a shipwright to experiment with new designs, making his own people's vessels faster and more seaworthy. Even something as fundamental as the concept of the wheel, which first emerged for making pottery, was adapted across trade routes for transportation, utterly revolutionizing how goods and people moved across the land. This constant, fluid interaction demanded new rules of engagement. As trade grew from occasional, personal barter into a regular, large-scale economic system, it required a framework of trust and predictability. Different groups meeting at trading posts needed to agree on the value of goods, leading to the development of early systems of measurement and, eventually, metal currency to simplify exchange. They needed mechanisms to resolve disputes peacefully, lest a disagreement over a damaged shipment of pottery escalate into a feud that shut down the entire route. This gave rise to some of the earliest forms of international law and diplomacy. Rulers began to establish formal agreements, promising safe passage to each other's merchants. Trading colonies were founded in foreign lands, operating under mutually agreed upon rules that protected commercial interests. The very need to facilitate and protect trade became a powerful incentive for cooperation over conflict, encouraging states to see each other not just as potential rivals, but also as valuable economic partners. Through this intricate and ever-expanding web of exchange, the world began to shrink. A community that once saw itself as the center of its own isolated universe suddenly found itself connected to a dozen others. A city on the Indus River could be influenced by architectural styles from Mesopotamia. Religious beliefs could travel along spice routes, merging with local deities to create new syncretic faiths. This connectivity was the final, crucial ingredient in the recipe for empire. It provided the economic surplus, the technological toolkit, and the multicultural mindset necessary to manage vast, diverse territories. These trade networks wove once separate threads of human culture into a rich, interconnected tapestry, setting the stage for the first true empires to emerge, not as isolated fortresses, but as the brilliant, bustling hubs of an entire interconnected world. This incredible web of trade and communication created nodes of intense activity, places where routes converged and goods were exchanged. Over time, these trading posts and religious sites swelled into something entirely new on the human landscape, the city. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast plain and seeing it for the first time, not a village of a few dozen homes, but a sprawling, buzzing metropolis like Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, or Memphis. Its skyline wasn't defined by trees or hills, but by human ambition made stone, towering ziggurats, immense palace complexes, and formidable walls that declared a permanent, powerful presence. This was urbanization, the physical manifestation of empire, a concentration of human energy and aspiration on a scale never before attempted. These early cities were multi-purpose engines designed to centralize power in every form. They were administrative hearts where scribes in bustling offices tracked the empire's wealth and governors issued decrees. They were religious centers where colossal temples attracted pilgrims and priests mediated with powerful gods. And they were commercial powerhouses with crowded markets offering goods from the farthest corners of the known world. The very layout of these cities spoke volumes about this new social order. Wide, processional ways were built for grand religious festivals and military parades, reinforcing state power and collective identity. Grid-like street plans, like those in the Indus Valley city of Mohenjo-Daro, reveal an astonishing level of central planning, with standardized brick sizes and sophisticated drainage systems running beneath the streets. Public spaces, great plazas, baths, and gardens became the stage for civic life, a stark contrast to the private, kinship-based world of the village. Yet, for all their grandeur, these dense urban environments presented a host of terrifying new problems. Packing thousands of people into a small area, often before the technology existed to support them properly, was a recipe for crisis. Sanitation was a constant nightmare. Without effective waste management, refuse and human waste accumulated in streets and alleyways, contaminating water sources and creating a perfect breeding ground for disease. Epidemics of dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses could sweep through a city with devastating speed, cutting down populations far more efficiently than any army. Social problems festered alongside the biological ones. The close proximity and vast inequality between a palace-dwelling elite and the cramped, mud-brick homes of the laborers created palpable tension. Crime, exploitation, and the anonymous chaos of city life were entirely new social phenomena that demanded new solutions. Meeting these challenges required an engineering and administrative revolution. Simply providing enough clean water for a large city was a monumental task. Civilizations like the Indus Valley people built elaborate networks of covered drains and canals, while the Romans would later master the art to construct soaring aqueducts that brought fresh water from miles away. Waste management systems, from sewage channels to organized garbage collection, became matters of public health and were often among the first services provided by early governments. And surrounding it all were those massive defensive walls, a necessary symbol of both power and paranoia, protecting the accumulated wealth within from envious outsiders. Governing this diverse, crowded, and often restless population demanded a move beyond tribal chieftainship. It required the invention of bureaucracy, a class of administrators who could apply written laws impartially to citizens who were not necessarily kin. Legal codes, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, were publicly displayed so everyone, in theory, knew the rules and the punishments. Police forces and court systems were established to maintain order and resolve disputes between strangers. A tax system was necessary to fund all this infrastructure and the army that protected it. The city, therefore, became the crucible where the tools of large-scale governance were forged and tested. Despite these immense challenges, or perhaps because of them, the city became an unrivaled engine of cultural innovation. This density of people, this collision of different ideas and skills, created a kind of intellectual friction that sparked brilliant new flames. Artists found patrons in temples and palaces. Scholars could gather in libraries, debating and building upon each other's ideas. Artisans, freed from farming, competed to create more beautiful pottery, more intricate metalwork, and more impressive architecture. It was in these urban cauldrons that writing evolved from simple accounting into literature and history, that mathematics and astronomy advanced to new levels of complexity, and that philosophy began to ask profound questions about the human condition. The city drew in the ambitious, the talented, and the curious from the countryside, concentrating human creativity in a way that forever accelerated the pace of cultural change. The city was not merely a place where people lived. It was a living, breathing organism that both drove and symbolized humanity's audacious leap from scattered bands to interconnected, monumental civilization. But how do you make thousands, even millions of people from different backgrounds and speaking different languages feel like they truly belong to one single entity? How do you convince a farmer from the Nile Delta, a sailor from the Levant, and a miner from the Sinai that they are all part of the same great project, all loyal to the same distant ruler? This was perhaps the greatest challenge early empires faced, and their most ingenious solution did not come from the sword or the law code, but from the spirit. They turned to the power of shared belief, crafting compelling religious and ideological narratives that could unite the human heart in a way force alone never could. At the very core of this strategy was the divine ruler. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a king chosen by the gods. He was considered a living god himself, the earthly incarnation of Horus. His word was divine law, and his success was directly tied to the favor of the cosmos. In Mesopotamia, rulers like Sargon of Akkad or Hammurabi of Babylon claimed a special, intimate relationship with the patron deities of their cities, positioning themselves as the sole, essential intermediaries between the heavenly and the earthly realms. This was a masterstroke of political ideology. It transformed obedience from a simple matter of practicality into a sacred duty. To question the pharaoh's command wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy, a risk to the cosmic order that guaranteed the annual flooding of the Nile and the fertility of the land. This divine mandate provided an unassailable justification for authority, demanding loyalty from every level of society. These beliefs were given physical form in the staggering temple complexes that dominated the skylines of early cities. Places like the Great Ziggurat of Ur or the Temple of Ammon at Karnak were far more than just places of worship. They were the beating hearts of the imperial economy, acting as massive redistribution centers for grain, livestock, and craft goods. They were banks storing wealth and facilitating complex transactions. They were centers of learning where scribes were trained, astronomical observations were recorded, and medical texts were compiled. And they were powerful political instruments, their priests often serving as key advisors to the throne. The very act of constructing these monuments, requiring the coordinated labor of thousands, was a powerful ideological project in itself, reinforcing the power of the state and the gods it served. The stories carved into their walls weren't mere decoration. They were official propaganda, depicting the ruler's military victories as acts of divine will, and his reign as a golden age of order triumphing over chaos. Beyond the walls of the temple, this state-sponsored ideology was woven into the very fabric of daily life through shared rituals and grand public festivals. Imagine the awesome spectacle of a religious procession in ancient Babylon, where a golden statue of the god Marduk was paraded through throngs of people, or the collective participation in the Opet festival in Thebes, which reaffirmed the divine nature of the pharaoh. These events created powerful emotional experiences, a sense of collective awe and belonging that could temporarily erase differences of class, ethnicity, or origin. Everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest laborer, shared in the same ritual, ate the same consecrated foods, and celebrated the same myths. This created a common cultural currency, a set of stories and symbols that everyone understood, fostering a unified identity that could supersede older, local tribal loyalties. Furthermore, empires cultivated secular ideologies that complemented their religious narratives. Concepts like Maat in Egypt or Me in Mesopotamia weren't just spiritual ideas. They were profound cultural values emphasizing order, truth, justice, and balance. These ideologies taught that everyone had a specific role to play in maintaining the stability of the state and the harmony of the cosmos. A farmer's duty to grow food, a soldier's duty to defend the borders, and a citizen's duty to pay taxes and contribute to communal labor projects were all framed as essential acts that upheld this divine order. This provided a powerful moral and philosophical motivation for people to accept their place in a highly stratified society and to contribute to massive, state-run projects. The construction of a pyramid or a vast irrigation network wasn't presented as back-breaking forced labor for a distant elite. It was a sacred duty, a collective offering to the gods that ensured the continued prosperity and protection of the entire civilization. This ideological framework was the invisible mortar that held the stones of empire together, inspiring a level of cooperation and sacrifice that was truly unprecedented in human history. This divine ideology, this powerful belief in a cosmic order embodied by the ruler, provided the moral and spiritual fuel for the imperial engine. But to translate that belief into tangible control over land and people, empires needed a more earthly instrument of power, a professional, organized, and overwhelming military force. The early days of tribal warfare, with seasonal raids and informal bands of warriors, were a far cry from the massive, disciplined armies that now marched under the banners of pharaohs and kings. This evolution from militia to military was one of the most critical transformations in the journey to empire. Consider the sheer organizational leap required. A nomadic band or early village might muster a fighting force of a few dozen men, armed with personal hunting weapons and led by a respected warrior. Their goals were often limited: a quick raid for livestock, the defense of a watering hole. But an empire's ambitions were boundless. To conquer and hold territory, they needed standing armies, thousands of full-time soldiers who did not farm or craft, but whose sole profession was war. This was an enormous economic investment, possible only because of the agricultural surplus and administrative systems we discussed earlier. The state now had to feed, clothe, arm, and pay these soldiers year-round. This professionalization changed everything. Soldiers could now undergo continuous, rigorous training, learning to fight in complex formations, to obey commands instantly, and to use standardized equipment. The iconic images we have of Roman legions moving as one or Assyrian phalanxes advancing behind massive shields were not the product of innate warrior spirit. They were the result of relentless drill, discipline, and a sophisticated military bureaucracy. This professional army was also a technological marvel, a walking showcase of the empire's most advanced metallurgy and engineering. The bronze spearhead that was once a rare treasure became standard issue. Chariots, initially status symbols, were integrated into combined arms tactics to terrifying effect, acting as mobile archery platforms that could shatter enemy lines. Later, the development of ironworking made weapons and armor stronger, cheaper, and more accessible, allowing for even larger armies. But technology wasn't just about weapons. It was about logistics, the unglamorous but utterly vital art of supplying a force on the move. An army, as the saying goes, marches on its stomach. A general had to solve the puzzle of moving tens of thousands of men, along with their food, water, and equipment, across hundreds of miles. This necessitated the building of military roads for rapid movement, the establishment of supply depots along planned routes, and the creation of specialized units dedicated to engineering and siegecraft. The ability to build a bridge across a river overnight or to construct a ramp to scale a city wall was often more decisive than simple bravery in battle. The immediate rewards of conquest were intoxicating and directly fueled the cycle of expansion. A successful campaign would bring a flood of plunder, precious metals, gems, artwork, and luxury goods that filled the imperial treasury. But more importantly, it brought two other key resources: people and land. Captured soldiers and civilians were often enslaved, providing a massive influx of labor for the empire's most demanding projects: mining, building temples and palaces, and working on large-scale agricultural estates. The conquered land itself was the ultimate prize. It could be parceled out to reward loyal generals and soldiers, creating a class of landowners with a vested interest in the empire's continued success. Or it could be incorporated directly, adding its agricultural output and population to the imperial tax base. This new wealth then paid for the next, even larger army, enabling the next, even more ambitious campaign. Conquest, in this sense, became a self-financing enterprise. However, the greatest empires understood that pure, brutal force had its limits. You could conquer a people with the sword, but you could not hold them with the sword alone, at least not forever. This is where strategy, diplomacy, and psychological warfare came into play. Wise rulers learned that offering favorable terms to a rival before a battle could sometimes achieve more than a costly victory. Allowing a defeated enemy to keep their local customs and leaders in place provided they swore allegiance and paid tribute, was often a more stable and efficient form of control than brutal repression. The Romans were masters of this, famously offering defeated peoples a path to eventual citizenship. This process of assimilation turned former enemies into loyal subjects who would then recruit for the very legions that had conquered them. The goal shifted from mere destruction to incorporation, weaving conquered territories and peoples into the fabric of the empire itself. The military was thus not just a weapon of destruction, but a tool for integration, its presence on a new frontier a constant reminder of the empire's power and the benefits or consequences of accepting its rule. This created an inescapable feedback loop that became the engine of imperial history. Every new territory conquered required administration. It needed governors, tax collectors, and garrisons to keep the peace. This expanded bureaucracy had to be paid for, which required more taxes and resources, and the most readily available source for those new resources was often yet another territory, just beyond the new frontier. Furthermore, each new border created new security concerns. A frontier is a line of contact, and it often brought the empire into conflict with new, external enemies, nomadic pastoralists or rival empires. To defend the new border, the empire had to station more troops there, which was expensive, and often the most effective form of defense was perceived to be further expansion to create a more defensible border, like a major river or a mountain range. This logic of preemptive security could propel an empire forward almost against its will. The army, therefore, was both the driver and the product of this cycle. Its successes created the need for its own expansion, and its expansion demanded further successes. In this way, the quest for security through military dominance became a relentless force that reshaped not just governments, but entire continents, drawing maps with the point of a spear and binding diverse cultures together in a complex, often uneasy, but enduring imperial embrace. Imagine the sheer impossibility of the task facing an early emperor. His domain now stretched across thousands of miles, encompassing mountain ranges, fertile river valleys, and arid deserts. Within these borders lived dozens of distinct peoples, each with their own language, gods, and ancient customs. How could one person, sitting in a single capital city, possibly hope to govern such a sprawling and diverse realm? The answer to this monumental challenge was not found in the charisma of a leader or the strength of an army alone, but in the quiet, methodical, and utterly revolutionary development of administration. This was the unsung hero of empire, the intricate, often invisible web of systems that transformed conquest into control and chaos into order. At the heart of this administrative machine was the humble but world-changing act of record-keeping. Scribes, armed with the new technology of writing, became the essential civil servants of the ancient world. In dusty offices and temple storerooms, they meticulously recorded everything. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia detail the exact number of sheep delivered as tax from a far-off village. Papyrus scrolls from Egypt list the wages paid to the laborers building a pharaoh's tomb. This was the birth of data management. By conducting regular censuses, empires could now know not just how much grain they had, but how many people they had to feed, tax, and recruit into their armies. Standardized weights and measures were introduced, ensuring that a bushel of grain in the capital was the same as a bushel of grain on the frontier. This created a system of breathtaking efficiency and accountability, allowing a central authority to track the wealth of the entire state down to the last handful of barley. It was this bureaucratic paperwork that funded everything, from the grand monuments we remember to the roads and canals we often forget. To manage this vastness, empires invented a brilliant organizational principle: decentralization with oversight. They divided their territories into manageable provinces, satrapies, or nomes. Each was placed under the control of a governor, personally appointed by and loyal to the central ruler. This governor's job was a delicate balancing act. On one hand, he was the face of imperial power, responsible for collecting taxes, raising troops, and enforcing the law. On the other hand, he had to be sensitive to local traditions. A smart administration learned that you could not simply impose your own customs on a conquered people. So, while the governor answered to the king, he often allowed local chieftains to handle day-to-day disputes, and local priests to continue worshipping their gods, perhaps just adding the empire's chief deity to the local pantheon. This flexible approach granted a crucial sense of autonomy to subject peoples, reducing the temptation to rebel, while ensuring that the empire's ultimate demands for resources and loyalty were always met. It was a pragmatic recipe for unity amidst diversity. Of course, even the most efficient tax collection is meaningless if the population doesn't believe in the fundamental fairness of the system. This is where the law stepped in, evolving from oral tradition into written code. The most famous of these, Hammurabi's Code from Babylon, was literally carved in stone for all to see. Its famous eye for an eye principle might seem harsh to us now, but its true revolution was its sheer existence and uniformity. For the first time, the law was not just the arbitrary whim of a local chieftain or the fading memory of an elder. It was a public, permanent, and standardized set of rules that applied to everyone, at least in theory. It covered everything from commercial contracts and property rights to family law and criminal punishment. This created a powerful sense of predictable justice. A merchant could travel to a distant city within the empire and know that the rules for resolving a trade dispute would be fundamentally the same as back home. Written law became the great equalizer and enforcer, reinforcing state authority by providing a clear, consistent framework for resolving the conflicts that are inevitable in any complex society. But a law unenforced is merely a suggestion, and a governor unheard from is effectively independent. The final, critical strand of the administrative web was communication. Empires invested staggering resources into building and maintaining infrastructure that bound the periphery to the center. The Persians built a magnificent 2,500-mile royal road, complete with way stations where imperial couriers on fresh horses could relay messages at a speed previously thought impossible. These messengers were the lifeblood of the empire, carrying everything from the king's decrees and military orders to reports on crop yields and potential unrest. This network ensured that a rebellion brewing in a distant province could be reported to the capital quickly enough for an army to be dispatched to quell it. It meant that a governor's ambitious overreach could be checked by a swift command from his sovereign. The flow of information became the central nervous system of the state, allowing the head to know what the hands and feet were doing and to direct them with purpose. Together, these elements, the bureaucracy, the provincial structure, the legal codes, and the communication networks formed an integrated system of governance that was far greater than the sum of its parts. It was this administrative genius that allowed a few to rule over many, transforming a collection of conquered territories into a functional, cohesive state. It harnessed the collective efforts of millions of people, channeling their labor and wealth toward colossal communal projects, from defensive walls that spanned horizons to irrigation systems that fed entire regions. This was the true machinery of empire working relentlessly in the background. Without this quiet revolution in organization and control, the dazzling cultural achievements of the ancient world would have remained an impossible dream, and the great transition from nomadic mobility to imperial monumentality would have collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Yet for all the administrative genius that held an empire together with laws and ledgers, there was another, more subtle force at work, one that wove the hearts and minds of diverse peoples into a shared sense of belonging. An empire might be built with a sword and managed with a scroll, but it truly flourished through a remarkable process of cultural synthesis, a creative blending of traditions that gave rise to entirely new and vibrant identities. Far from being monolithic entities imposing a single, rigid culture, the most successful empires acted more like great cultural sponges, absorbing the customs, beliefs, and innovations of every people they encountered and creating something uniquely their own from the mix. Consider the practical reality of conquest. A victorious army doesn't just capture land and resources, it acquires people. Suddenly, the empire's population includes men and women who speak different languages, worship different gods, and tell different stories about how the world began. A short-sighted ruler might try to crush these differences, to force everyone to speak the same tongue and pray to the same deities. But history shows us that the empires that endured, the ones we remember as truly great, took a far more clever and pragmatic approach. They understood that you cannot erase a culture with a decree. Instead, they became masters of adoption and adaptation, seamlessly weaving the strongest threads from conquered traditions into the imperial tapestry. This wasn't just an act of tolerance, it was a brilliant strategy for governance. By incorporating a conquered people's deity into the official state pantheon, a ruler could say to them, "Your gods are not defeated, they have simply joined our court. Your beliefs are honored here." This act of spiritual inclusion was a powerful tool for legitimizing rule and fostering loyalty, making new subjects feel less like a subjugated people and more like new partners in a grand civilizational project. This cultural alchemy manifested in stunningly beautiful ways, particularly in art and architecture. The fascinating genre of Greco-Buddhist art that emerged in the wake of Alexander the Great's campaigns into Central Asia and India is a perfect example. Greek colonists and soldiers, steeped in an artistic tradition that celebrated the idealized human form, found themselves in a land where Buddhist teachings were spreading. Greek sculptors, trained to carve the muscular physiques of Apollo and Zeus, began applying their skills to depicting the Buddha. The result was a revolutionary new artistic style. The Buddha, previously represented only by symbols like a footprint or an empty throne, suddenly took on a human form, but one rendered with the graceful proportions, flowing drapery, and serene countenance of a Greek god. This hybrid style, born from the collision of two worlds, didn't just please both cultures. It created an entirely new visual language for Buddhism that would eventually travel along the Silk Road and shape the art of China, Korea, and Japan. The empire, in this case, acted as a gigantic cultural incubator. The Romans were perhaps the ultimate virtuosos of this practice, a talent they called interpretatio Romana, the Roman interpretation. Rather than dismissing the gods of conquered peoples as false, they simply identified them with their own deities. The powerful Celtic god of sky and thunder, Tyronis, was seen as a manifestation of Jupiter. The Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite, became synonymous with their own Venus. This wasn't a one-way street of assimilation. It was a genuine exchange that enriched Roman culture itself. When they conquered Greece, they didn't just plunder its statues, they adopted its philosophy, its literary styles, and its architectural orders, blending them with their own engineering prowess to create something distinctly Roman. Their temples became Greek in form but Roman in scale and purpose. This genius for synthesis created a common cultural currency that stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the misty highlands of Britain. A citizen in Roman Gaul could make an offering at a temple that looked familiar to him, even if the name of the god was Latin, because it was built upon a shared, synthesized understanding of the divine. This constant cross-pollination of ideas became a tremendous source of resilience and innovation for imperial states. A medical technique discovered in Egypt, an architectural solution developed in Persia, or a legal concept refined in Mesopotamia could be adopted, adapted, and improved upon anywhere within the empire's vast borders. This diversity of knowledge acted as a kind of cultural insurance policy. If one tradition's approach to a problem failed, another's might succeed. By drawing on a wide repertoire of customs and technologies, synthesized empires could be more flexible and creative in responding to crises, from famine and disease to invasion and social unrest. Their strength was not in cultural purity, but in their dynamic, ever-evolving hybridity. They proved that the most enduring cultures are not walls meant to keep influence out, but sponges designed to absorb it, constantly remaking themselves in a beautiful, ongoing conversation between the old and the new, the familiar and the foreign. This intricate web of administration and cultural blending required a powerful engine to sustain it, an engine powered by a revolutionary new economic system. The days of simple barter, of trading a handful of obsidian arrowheads for an animal skin, were utterly inadequate for the scale of imperial ambition. The economic foundations of empires had to be as vast and complex as the empires themselves, evolving into sophisticated machines designed for one primary purpose: to generate, manage, and concentrate wealth on an unprecedented scale. At its heart, this system still relied on the ancient act of farming, but now agriculture was transformed from a means of survival into a calculated enterprise. Vast swaths of land were organized not for family subsistence, but for maximum yield. Irrigation canals, plows pulled by domesticated oxen, and crop rotation techniques all worked in concert to force the land to produce far more than its inhabitants could possibly eat. This was no longer about filling a cooking pot for the evening meal. It was about filling massive state granaries to the brim, creating a food surplus that was the absolute prerequisite for everything that made an empire possible. That surplus was the lifeblood of the entire imperial organism. It was this stored grain that fed the full-time soldiers who guarded the frontiers, allowing them to train and fight without ever needing to till a field. It fed the legions of scribes and tax collectors who populated the growing bureaucracies, their papyrus scrolls and clay tablets tracking the empire's wealth down to the last bushel. It fed the thousands of laborers who toiled on public works projects, from the bricklayers on a ziggurat to the engineers surveying a new aqueduct. This liberation of human effort from the daily grind of food production unleashed an explosion of specialization. For the first time in history, a person's identity could be defined not by their tribe but by their trade. A vibrant new class structure emerged, with master potters creating exquisite wares for elite households, metalworkers smelting bronze for both tools and tributes, and merchants acting as the crucial circulatory system, moving goods from where they were plentiful to where they were desired. This economic diversification wasn't just a sign of progress. It was a source of immense resilience and growth, creating interdependencies that wove the empire's far-flung regions into a single, functioning economic unit. To facilitate this complex web of exchange, empires had to solve the inherent clumsiness of barter. How do you pay a soldier if his wages are in grain, but he needs a new pair of sandals? The solution was one of history's most transformative innovations: standardized currency. By stamping pieces of metal with a royal seal that guaranteed their weight and purity, empires created a universal medium of value. A silver shekel from Mesopotamia or a gold darak from Persia was accepted anywhere within the empire's influence, instantly simplifying trade and taxation. A farmer could now sell his surplus for coin and use that coin to pay his taxes directly to the state, which then used that same coin to pay its soldiers and officials. This created a smooth, efficient flow of wealth that lubricated the entire economy. Currency also became a powerful tool of propaganda. The face of the emperor on every coin was a constant, everyday reminder of whose authority backed this economic system and guaranteed its value, making the ruler's presence felt in every market transaction across his domain. With this sophisticated system in place, the state could now intervene in the economy with a purpose and precision previously unimaginable. This wasn't a free market, it was a managed economy designed for imperial stability and glory. Governments implemented price controls on essential goods like grain to prevent famine-induced unrest during poor harvests. They held monopolies on critical resources like salt, mining, or the production of purple dye, ensuring that the most profitable ventures filled the state's coffers directly. Perhaps most impressively, they launched massive public works projects that were economic stimuli in the ancient world. Building a network of roads, for instance, was a military necessity for moving troops, but it also drastically reduced the cost and risk for merchants, boosting trade and economic integration. Constructing a grand port facility not only enhanced naval power, but also created a hub of commercial activity that generated tax revenue for centuries. The state became the economy's largest consumer, its most powerful investor, and its ultimate regulator, harnessing market forces to serve the overarching goals of defense, administration, and monumental construction. This ability to mobilize and direct economic activity on a colossal scale was the true magic behind the ancient world's wonders, proving that economic complexity was the invisible architect of imperial majesty. Imagine the profound shift from a world where disputes were settled around a campfire by respected elders, their judgments based on memory and custom, to one where the rules were literally set in stone for all to see. This was the monumental leap made possible by the world's first legal codes. In small, kinship-based nomadic bands, justice was personal, immediate, and flexible. But as villages exploded into cities and empires absorbed diverse populations, those old informal traditions became a recipe for chaos. How could a merchant from one culture trust that a contract with someone from a completely different background would be honored? How could a state prevent a simple argument over a water channel from escalating into a bloody, generations-long feud between families? The answer was to move justice out of the realm of memory and into the realm of writing, to create a system that was bigger than any individual, family, or tribe. This was the birth of codified law, a revolutionary technology for social order that sought to replace the volatility of personal vengeance with the cool, impartial force of the state. The earliest known example of this ambition comes from the Sumerian king Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE. His code wasn't just a list of punishments, it was a declaration of principle. It began by establishing his authority and his commitment to ensuring that the orphan did not fall prey to the wealthy and the widow did not fall prey to the powerful. This was law as a tool for social justice and stability. Crucially, his system introduced the concept of restitution compensation for a wrong, rather than purely punitive measures. For instance, if a man broke another's foot, he would pay a specific amount of silver. This was a world away from the old eye for an eye logic that could spiral out of control. It placed a measurable economic value on harm, making conflict resolution predictable and preventing cycles of violence. This set a powerful precedent, creating a legal framework designed not just to punish, but to repair the social fabric and allow people to move on. Centuries later, the Romans would perfect this concept with their 12 tables, carved on bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum around 450 BCE. The story of their creation itself speaks to the social pressures that demanded formal law. Plebeians, the common citizens, revolted against the ruling patrician class, arguing that justice was arbitrary because the laws were unwritten and known only to the elite priests and magistrates. The demand was simple: publish the rules. The resulting 12 tables covered everything from courtroom procedure and debt to inheritance and public behavior. Their great achievement was accessibility. Now any Roman citizen could, in theory, know the law and use it. This transformed the relationship between the individual and the state. Justice was no longer a secret whispered among the powerful. It was a public right. A farmer could now cite a specific table to defend his property, and a debtor knew exactly what his rights were. This transparency was a foundational pillar of Roman identity and a key reason for the stability and integrability of their vast empire. To bring these written codes to life, empires had to invent a new kind of space and a new kind of person: the courtroom and the judge. In a tribal setting, the judge was often a temporary role filled by a respected elder. In an empire, it became a formal office. Judges, magistrates, and praetors were appointed to serve as the living embodiment of the law's impartiality. Their primary function was to serve as a neutral third party, to hear evidence from disputing sides, who were often complete strangers to one another, and to render a verdict based not on personal relationship or tribal loyalty, but on the published standards of the legal code. This was a profound shift. It actively worked to dismantle the ancient right of vendetta, of personal revenge, and instead claimed that the state alone held the legitimate monopoly over violence and justice. A wronged individual was now encouraged to bring their grievance to a state official rather than taking up a weapon. This didn't just resolve individual conflicts, it systematically disarmed the population and centralized the authority to punish, which is one of the most fundamental powers any state can wield. Beyond simply keeping the peace, these legal systems were powerful tools for ideological messaging. The laws themselves were a curriculum in imperial values. Statutes enforcing contracts taught the importance of honesty and keeping one's word. Laws that heavily punished treason and sedition drilled in the supreme value of loyalty to the state and the ruler. Property laws that reinforced inheritance from father to son cemented the social hierarchy and the patriarchal family structure. The very act of going to court reinforced the idea of a structured, hierarchical society where every person had a defined place and a set of obligations. The law became a daily teacher, instructing citizens on how to be good, compliant members of the empire simply by regulating their everyday interactions. It was soft power at its most effective, shaping hearts and minds not through conquest, but through the mundane mechanics of dispute resolution and economic regulation. For the diverse peoples pulled into an expanding empire, this legal framework offered a compelling bargain. Conquest could be terrifying and oppressive, but the introduction of a uniform legal system offered a pathway to participation and protection. A conquered individual, once subject to the whims of a local chieftain, was now, in theory, under the equal protection of the emperor's law. The Roman concept of civitas, citizenship, was the ultimate expression of this. It wasn't primarily an ethnic identity, it was a legal status. It granted a person specific, enforceable rights: the right to a trial, the right to make contracts, the right to marry legally anywhere in the empire. This was an incredibly powerful incentive for assimilation. A person in Gaul or Syria could become a Roman in the eyes of the law, with all the privileges that entailed, without having to abandon all of their local customs. The law acted as a great integrator, creating a common legal identity that could transcend differences in language, religion, and local tradition, weaving 1,000 different threads into a single, strong imperial fabric. But how do you ensure that a complex legal code is understood, that a tax collector can perform his calculations, or that an architect can replicate the precise proportions of a temple design across 1,000 miles of empire? The answer lies in another monumental shift, the move from knowledge as an oral tradition passed down within families to education as a formal, state-sponsored institution. Empires quickly realized that their survival depended on more than just armies and laws. It required a sophisticated bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy needed a constant, reliable supply of trained minds. This necessity gave birth to the world's first schools, transforming learning from a personal inheritance into a public utility for imperial administration. The earliest of these institutions were often attached to temples or palaces, and their curriculum was intensely practical. In Mesopotamia, the adaba, or tablet house, was the training ground for the empire's most vital civil servants, the scribes. Imagine the scene: rows of young students, mostly from elite families, sitting cross-legged, their hands meticulously shaping wet clay tablets with reed styluses. Their days were filled with repetitive drills, copying standardized word lists and mathematical tables. They learned the complex cuneiform script not to write poetry, but to draft contracts, record harvest yields, and compose diplomatic correspondence. This was education as a tool of statecraft, designed to produce a class of literate officials who could ensure the smooth functioning of the government's vast accounting and communication systems. A mistake in a multiplication table could mean a miscalculation in grain rations for a battalion. An error in a land survey could spark a border dispute. The precision required in these schools was the bedrock of imperial precision. Beyond the practical scribble schools, some empires fostered centers of higher learning that became magnets for intellectual pursuit. In ancient India, large institutions like Taxila and Nalanda emerged as renowned universities, attracting scholars from across Asia. Here, the curriculum expanded far beyond administration to include medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and advanced mathematics. These were places of vibrant debate and innovation, where knowledge was not just preserved but actively advanced. Similarly, in Greece, the academy founded by Plato and the Lyceum established by Aristotle formalized philosophical inquiry, creating structured environments for developing and challenging ideas about the natural world, ethics, and governance. These academies produced the thinkers whose ideas would later be adopted and adapted by empires, providing the intellectual framework for everything from legal systems to scientific understanding. To support this educational project, empires undertook the most ambitious project of all, the systematic collection and preservation of knowledge. The great libraries of the ancient world, like those in Alexandria and Nineveh, were not mere repositories of books. They were the equivalent of ancient data centers and think tanks combined. The library at Alexandria, funded by the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, had an astonishing and aggressive acquisition policy. Every ship that docked in the city's harbor was searched for scrolls. Any found were confiscated, copied by the library's army of scribes, and then the copies were returned to the owners while the originals were added to the collection. This effort created a vast archive that aimed to contain all the knowledge of the known world: Greek plays, Egyptian medical texts, Babylonian astronomical observations, and Phoenician trade logs. This concentration of information in one place allowed scholars to compare, contrast, and synthesize ideas from different cultures on an unprecedented scale, leading to breakthroughs in geometry, geography, and engineering. This drive to centralize and standardize knowledge had profoundly practical implications for everyday life across the empire. The development of an accurate calendar, for instance, was not an abstract scientific exercise. It was an administrative necessity. A standardized calendar told farmers in every province the exact optimal time to plant and harvest, maximizing agricultural yields and ensuring the food surplus that fed cities and armies. It allowed the state to coordinate religious festivals, tax collection dates, and military campaigns across vast distances. Similarly, handbooks on architecture and engineering, copied and distributed to regional governors, ensured that a bridge, an aqueduct, or a granary built in one part of the empire would be structurally sound and built to a familiar design. This dissemination of best practices was a force multiplier, raising the technological floor of the entire civilization and creating a recognizable imperial aesthetic from Britain to Syria. The ultimate outcome of this institutionalization of learning was the creation of a new social class, the imperial intellectual. These were the scholars, scientists, poets, and historians whose work was supported by the state's infrastructure. A figure like the Babylonian astronomer Kidinu could use centuries of recorded observations to develop sophisticated models for predicting lunar eclipses. Roman engineers like Vitruvius could compile encyclopedic volumes on architecture that distilled knowledge from across the Mediterranean. This state-sponsored intellectualism led to a cultural flourishing that defined these civilizations for millennia. The epic poetry of Virgil's Aeneid, for example, was more than just a great story. It was a piece of statecraft that provided a mythical origin story for the Roman people, justifying their divine right to rule and fostering a shared sense of identity. Education became the most durable tool of imperial cohesion, seamlessly transmitting the core values, technical skills, and shared history of the civilization from one generation to the next, ensuring that even as emperors rose and fell, the foundational culture of the empire endured. Yet this drive to build and create was about far more than just raw displays of power. It was a sophisticated language of stone and pigment used to communicate with both the populace and the gods. Every aspect of a monumental project was meticulously designed to convey a specific message. The sheer, inaccessible height of a pyramid's apex, pointing directly to the heavens, physically manifested the pharaoh's unique role as the sole link between the earthly and the divine. The intimidating, colossal statues of rulers that flanked palace entrances or temple avenues were not meant to be lifelike portraits, but overwhelming representations of imperial authority, designed to make any subject feel small and insignificant in their presence. Even the choice of materials spoke volumes. Obtaining towering obelisks from a single piece of granite or lining a throne room with rare cedar wood imported from distant lands was a deliberate statement. It proclaimed the empire's vast reach, its control over exotic resources, and its ability to command the impossible, transforming raw materials from the edges of the known world into symbols of central power. This imperial aesthetic was rarely imposed in a crude, top-down manner. Its true genius often lay in its ability to absorb and synthesize. As empires expanded, engulfing diverse cultures with their own rich artistic traditions, a fascinating process of blending began. Imperial architects and artists didn't simply erase local styles, they frequently incorporated them, creating a hybrid visual language that felt both familiar and new to subject peoples. A conquered region might see its traditional decorative motifs, a specific style of spiral, a local animal symbol woven into the grand mosaics of a new imperial bathhouse, or carved into the capitals of columns in a state-sponsored temple. This was cultural politics at its most effective. By honoring and including elements of local identity within the overarching imperial style, the ruling power offered a visual promise of inclusion. It suggested that one could be a citizen of the vast empire while still retaining a sense of regional pride, that loyalty to the emperor could coexist with reverence for local gods and heroes. This synthesized art became a powerful, silent tool for integration, making the reality of foreign rule more palatable and visually legitimizing the new political order. The narrative power of this art extended beyond buildings into the realm of public storytelling. The walls of palaces and the sides of monumental arches became the canvas for imperial propaganda, functioning like stone newspapers broadcasting the state's greatest hits. In places like ancient Persia and Rome, vast, detailed reliefs depicted scenes of conquest in painstaking detail. You would see the emperor, always shown larger than any other figure, accepting the surrender of humbled enemies who are often carved in a smaller, more supplicant scale. These scenes were not historically accurate reports but carefully crafted ideologies. They portrayed the empire's wars not as brutal acts of aggression but as righteous victories over chaos, bringing order and civilization to barbaric lands. Other panels might show long processions of representatives from every corner of the empire, each bringing their distinctive tribute, a visual catalogue of the state's diversity and wealth, reinforcing the message that all peoples were united in service to a single, powerful center. For a largely illiterate population, these images were the primary source of their understanding of the empire's power and purpose, shaping their perception of reality itself. Yet to see imperial art solely as a tool of state propaganda is to miss its profound role in enriching the texture of everyday existence. The same artistic drive that erected pyramids also elevated the common objects of daily life. A simple clay oil lamp, mass-produced for use across the Roman Empire, might be adorned with a finely molded image of a gladiator, a ship, or a popular deity. Even the humblest citizen could partake in a shared visual culture through the designs on their pottery, the patterns woven into their textiles, or the style of their jewelry. These everyday objects did more than just beautify the home. They were markers of identity and status, reflecting personal taste, religious devotion, and economic standing. The widespread adoption of certain artistic styles in consumer goods also helped to foster a common cultural identity, a sense of shared aesthetics that bound together people from different provinces. The empire was thus made tangible not just in towering monuments, but in the very objects people held in their hands, a constant, subtle reminder of the complex, interconnected world they now inhabited. Ultimately, the most enduring legacy of this artistic explosion was the creation of a permanent, tangible memory. Nomadic cultures carried their history in stories and songs, ephemeral and changing with each telling. Settled empires built theirs to last, an inscribed stela, a carved victory column, a painted tomb chamber. These were attempts to freeze a moment, to assert a specific version of events into eternity. They were a declaration that the empire, its rulers, and its achievements were not fleeting phenomena but permanent fixtures in the grand story of humanity. Long after the political structures had crumbled, the armies had disbanded, and the administrative systems were forgotten, these artistic creations remained. They became the very evidence through which we understand these ancient civilizations today. The art and architecture of empire were the ultimate statement in a conversation with time itself, a bold argument against oblivion that ensured the cultural transition from mobility to monumentality would echo for thousands of years, speaking to us still in the silent, majestic language of stone. This profound restructuring of society created a world where your place was no longer determined solely by your skills or character, but by the circumstances of your birth and the rigid class you were born into. In the fluid world of nomadic bands, a talented hunter or a wise storyteller could earn respect and influence regardless of their family. But in the sprawling cities of early empires, you were often born into your destiny. A farmer's son would till the soil, a potter's daughter would shape clay, and a slave's child would inherit that same bound status. This was the birth of social class as an inherited, inescapable reality. The pyramid of power was now cemented in place, with a tiny, luxurious apex and a vast, laboring base. At the very top sat the ruler and his immediate family, often considered divine or semi-divine, living in palaces surrounded by unimaginable wealth. Just below them were the high priests and the noble families, who controlled the vast temple estates and the most fertile lands, acting as the crucial administrators and advisors who translated the ruler's will into action. Their power was a combination of sacred authority, economic control, and political clout, making them the true engine of the imperial state. This new hierarchy wasn't just accepted passively. It was actively sold to the population through a powerful and sophisticated blend of religion and ideology. Rulers and priests worked in concert to create a compelling narrative that this unequal system was not merely a human invention, but a reflection of a divine and natural order. In ancient Egypt, the concept of Maat encompassing truth, justice, and cosmic balance was invoked to justify the pharaoh's absolute power and the fixed roles of every subject. Everyone had their place in maintaining this harmony, from the high priest performing rituals to the lowly farmer watering his fields. To step outside your assigned role was to invite chaos, not just socially but cosmically. In Mesopotamia, the creation epic, the Enuma Elish, told how the god Marduk created humans from the blood of a defeated rebel god for the explicit purpose of serving the deities, thereby framing all human labor, especially that of the lower classes, as a sacred duty. This ideological framework was incredibly effective. It transformed social inequality from an injustice to be recentered into a sacred duty to be fulfilled, encouraging the peasant to see his back-breaking labor not as exploitation for the elite's benefit, but as his essential contribution to keeping the world itself functioning properly. Economic specialization acted as the practical engine that reinforced these ideological divisions. As societies grew more complex, the number of specialized jobs exploded. But not all jobs were valued equally. The prestige of a profession was rarely tied to its difficulty or its importance to survival, but rather to its proximity to power, religion, or leisure. A goldsmith crafting jewelry for the temple or the palace was held in far higher esteem than a farmer who grew the food that fed the entire city. A scribe, with his rare literacy and his role in the administrative machinery, occupied a privileged middle layer, while the countless manual laborers who built the monuments he recorded were considered mere cogs in the machine. This created a paradox where the most physically essential jobs, farming, mining, construction, were often the least valued and worst compensated, while roles that managed, documented, or sanctified the wealth generated by others climbed the social ladder. This economic reality made the social pyramid feel inevitable and natural. It wasn't just that the elite had more. It was that the very structure of the economy was designed to ensure they could keep getting more, generation after generation, while those at the bottom remained trapped in cycles of labor with little hope of accumulation. Yet, for all its rigidity, this system was not a completely sealed trap. Cracks of mobility did exist, providing just enough hope to maintain stability and channel ambitious energy toward supporting the system rather than overthrowing it. The military often served as the most reliable ladder for a commoner to climb. A brave and loyal soldier could be rewarded with land, a share of plunder, or even a promotion to a minor officer's rank, granting him and his family a step up in status. Trade was another potential avenue. A savvy merchant, by amassing enough wealth, could sometimes buy his way into a higher social circle, perhaps marrying his daughter into a financially struggling noble family, thereby grafting new money onto old status. In rare cases, exceptional talent in a valued craft or even in scholarship could attract the patronage of a wealthy noble, offering a path out of obscurity. These narrow pathways were vital pressure valves. They allowed the empire to benefit from the talents of its entire population, not just the elite, and they created the powerful illusion that the hierarchy was based on merit, or at least that merit could be rewarded within it. This prevented the system from becoming entirely stagnant and fostered a sense of possibility, however remote, that was crucial for maintaining social order. This intricate, layered social structure became the defining feature of imperial life, a double-edged sword that provided both remarkable stability and deep-seated tension. On one hand, it was incredibly efficient. By clearly defining roles and streamlining the allocation of labor and resources, it allowed for the coordination of massive projects, irrigation networks, standing armies, monumental construction that would have been impossible in a more egalitarian society. Everyone knew their place and their duty, creating a predictable and orderly system. On the other hand, this same rigidity bred resentment and conflict. The vast gulf between the opulence of the palace and the grinding poverty of the fields was a constant, visible reminder of inequality. Famine, increased taxation, or the perception of injustice could easily ignite unrest, from food riots to peasant revolts. The history of empires is littered with these outbursts, which forced rulers to occasionally reform, to cancel debts, adjust tax rates, or make grand displays of charity. This push and pull between the functional need for a hierarchy and the human desire for fairness became a central dynamic of imperial history, a tension that would forever shape the laws, ethics, and very soul of the civilizations we inherited from this great transition. This transformation of gender roles represents one of the most profound and personal shifts in the journey from nomadic life to settled empire. To understand its depth, we need to look at the daily reality of a nomadic band. In these highly mobile groups, survival was a collective effort where every able body's contribution was essential. Women were far from passive dependence. They were co-architects of their community's survival. Their deep knowledge of the local environment was critical. They were the primary gatherers, identifying which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, and where to find them across changing seasons. This responsibility for securing a significant portion of the group's calories granted them substantial influence. Furthermore, the portable nature of their existence meant that property accumulation was minimal. Leadership was often situational and based on capability rather than rigid gender rules. A woman known for her wisdom, healing skills, or diplomatic acumen could easily find herself in a position of respect and decision-making authority around the campfire. Gender norms existed, but they were necessarily fluid, adapting to the immediate challenges of a life on the move. The adoption of agriculture and the dawn of settled life fundamentally rewrote this contract between the sexes. The invention of the plow was a particularly pivotal technological turning point. Plow agriculture is physically demanding, often requiring the upper body strength that tends to be more prevalent in males. This gradually pushed men into the primary role of field cultivation, while women's responsibilities became increasingly centered on the now permanent home. The very concept of property underwent a radical change. For the first time, families could claim ownership of a specific, valuable piece of land, an asset that could be improved, inherited, and fought over. As societies began to prioritize the clear lineage of inheritance to keep property within patrilineal families, control over female sexuality and reproduction became a central concern. This economic shift created a new ideology that associated men with production and the public sphere of the field, while women became symbolically linked to reproduction and the private sphere of the domestic realm. Their vital work in food processing, textile production, and child rearing, while still economically crucial, was now perceived as secondary to the male-dominated act of generating the agricultural surplus itself. This trend didn't just continue with the rise of empires, it was codified and hardened into law and custom. Imperial states, with their need for order, hierarchy, and predictable succession, found the patriarchal family to be a convenient microcosm of the state itself. The king ruled the empire, the father ruled the household. Legal codes from Mesopotamia to Rome systematically stripped women of legal personhood. A woman typically passed from the authority of her father to that of her husband, with limited rights to own property independently, initiate divorce, or serve as a legal witness in court. Educational opportunities were almost exclusively reserved for boys from elite families, who were being groomed for roles in the bureaucracy, priesthood, or military institutions from which women were largely barred. Primary civic role for a woman was increasingly defined as that of a mother who produced legitimate male heirs to continue the family line and serve the state. This institutionalization of gender inequality ensured that the vast administrative, economic, and intellectual machinery of the empire would be operated almost entirely by men. Yet, the historical record is wonderfully complicated, revealing fascinating exceptions that prove the rule. Even within these rigid systems, determined women found avenues to wield significant power and influence. One of the most common paths was through religion. In many empires, women could hold powerful positions as priestesses, oracles, or devotees of certain goddesses. The high priestess of a major temple could control vast economic resources, offer counsel to rulers, and enjoy a level of autonomy and respect denied to most women. Trade was another potential avenue for agency. While often operating within legal constraints, women in mercantile cultures could sometimes run their own businesses, manage caravans, and accumulate personal wealth, using their economic clout to gain a measure of independence. And of course, there were the extraordinary women who broke through the highest glass ceilings of all the rulers. Figures like Hatshepsut in Egypt, who ruled as a full pharaoh, or the cunning Empress Lu of China, who wielded immense power from behind the throne, demonstrate that even the most patriarchal systems could not always contain female ambition. Their stories, however, were often the exceptions that highlighted the rule, and their reigns were frequently followed by backlashes meant to prevent such a thing from happening again. This great gendered restructuring was not a uniform process that unfolded identically across the globe. Cultural variations created a rich tapestry of experiences. The status of women in the imperial court of China, bound by strict Confucian ideals of obedience, was vastly different from that of a woman in the bustling commercial port of Phoenician Carthage. In Sparta, a unique militaristic culture placed a premium on women's physical health and management of estates, while men were constantly at war, granting them notably more rights and freedoms than their Athenian counterparts. These variations remind us that while the broad trend towards patriarchy was a near-universal feature of early states, its intensity and expression were shaped by local economic needs, religious beliefs, and social structures. It was not an inevitable biological destiny, but a cultural and economic adaptation, one that served the primary imperial goals of stabilizing property rights, ensuring clear lines of inheritance, and maintaining a hierarchical social order. The legacy of this ancient transition is not merely a historical curiosity. It echoes powerfully in our modern world. the deep-seated associations between masculinity and public leadership, or femininity and domestic care, have roots that stretch back to this pivotal shift from foraging to farming and state building. The legal frameworks that once restricted women's rights were the precursors to systems that had to be challenged and reformed piece by piece over centuries. Understanding that these norms were constructed over millennia in response to specific economic and political conditions allows us to see them not as natural or immutable, but as human creations. This historical perspective empowers us to continue the work of re-examining and renegotiating gender roles, recognizing that the journey from nomadic flexibility to imperial rigidity was a turning point that continues to shape the most intimate aspects of our lives, our families, and our societies today. This dramatic shift from a life of taking only what nature offered to one of actively reshaping the world came with an environmental cost that would have been unimaginable to our nomadic ancestors. The very first act of empire building was often an act of deforestation. To clear land for vast, open fields of wheat and barley, ancient farmers set fire to ancient woodlands or methodically cut down trees with their new bronze and iron axes. To build their monumental cities, they needed incredible quantities of timber for the roofs of palaces, for the scaffolding of ziggurats, and for the beams that held up their grand temples. And to fuel the furnaces of their burgeoning industries, especially the incredibly wood-hungry process of smelting metal, they consumed forests at a staggering rate. The hills around early cities like Uruk or Knossos were likely stripped bare, transforming once forested slopes into open scrubland. This loss of tree cover had immediate and devastating consequences. Without the deep root systems of trees to hold it in place, the rich topsoil, built up over millennia, was now vulnerable. Torrential rains would wash it away, clogging rivers with silt and robbing the land of its fertility, a problem that plagued empires from Mesopotamia to Rome. This deforestation also meant a catastrophic loss of habitat, driving away game animals and reducing the biodiversity that had once been a key source of resilience for earlier societies. Perhaps the most ambitious and consequential environmental engineering project of the ancient world was the large-scale manipulation of water. In river valleys like those of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile, empires unleashed the power of irrigation on a colossal scale. They dug thousands of miles of canals, channeling life-giving water to fields far from the riverbanks, effectively creating artificial oases of incredible productivity. This allowed populations to explode, but it also created a hidden, insidious problem: salinization. In hot, dry climates, water brought to the surface evaporates quickly, leaving behind dissolved salts that it picked up from the earth. Over time, these salts accumulate in the soil, creating a toxic white crust that chokes plant life and renders the land barren. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia record the heartbreaking decline in crop yields over centuries, with wheat, a salt-sensitive crop, gradually being replaced by more tolerant but less nutritious barley. It's a powerful example of an empire inadvertently poisoning the very land that gave it life, a sobering lesson in unintended consequences. Furthermore, by diverting so much water for agriculture, these societies often placed immense strain on their water sources, potentially lowering water tables and creating conflicts between upstream and downstream users, a challenge that resonates deeply with water scarcity issues we face today. The rise of dense urban centers introduced a completely new kind of environmental challenge: concentrated pollution. For the first time, thousands of people lived together in a very small area, generating waste on an unprecedented scale. The streets of even the most advanced ancient cities could be foul places, with garbage and human waste often simply tossed out of doors to accumulate in alleys or flow through open drains. Without modern understanding of germs and sanitation, this waste would frequently contaminate the local water supply, leading to devastating outbreaks of waterborne diseases like dysentery and typhoid, which could sweep through a crowded population with terrifying speed. The industrial activities of the city added another layer of pollution. Workshops for pottery, metalworking, and tanning leather dumped byproducts like heavy metals, chemical residues, and other toxins directly into the soil and nearby waterways. Archaeological evidence from ancient mining sites shows landscapes scarred by their activities and river sediments still contaminated with lead and copper thousands of years later. The city, that great engine of culture and innovation, had also become a point source of environmental degradation, creating public health crises that its leaders struggled to comprehend, let alone manage. Faced with these mounting challenges, some empires did not simply exploit blindly. They developed remarkably sophisticated conservation practices, demonstrating an early understanding of sustainability. The need for a steady supply of crucial resources forced them to think long-term. We have records from Mesopotamia detailing royal edicts protecting certain lucrative groves of date palms, with harsh penalties for anyone caught cutting them down. In other regions, rulers established what were effectively the world's first game reserves, declaring vast tracts of royal forest off-limits to hunting by commoners, ensuring that the elite would always have game for their sport and tables. The most famous early codification of conservation might come from the Mauryan Empire in India. The great Emperor Ashoka, in his famous Pillar Edicts, issued proclamations protecting forests and certain species of animals from unnecessary slaughter, motivated by both Buddhist compassion and a clear-eyed understanding of the need to preserve his kingdom's natural wealth. These were not modern environmentalist movements driven by a love of nature for its own sake, but rather pragmatic policies of resource management. They reveal a dawning realization that the empire's wealth was not infinite, that the seemingly endless bounty of the land could be exhausted if not managed with care and foresight. This ancient dance between monumental achievement and environmental cost offers us a powerful mirror for our own time. The story of imperial salinization in Mesopotamia is a stark precursor to the soil degradation issues that challenge modern industrial agriculture. The deforestation of the Lebanese cedar forests to build the cities and fleets of empires echoes in the large-scale clearing of rainforests today. Their struggles with urban pollution and waste management, while on a different scale, reflect our own ongoing challenges with industrial contamination and plastic waste. The key lesson is that no civilization, no matter how brilliant or powerful, operates in a vacuum. It exists within an ecological system, and its grandest projects are built upon a foundation of natural resources that can be depleted or damaged. The most resilient empires were those that recognized this interdependence and developed systems to manage it, however imperfectly. Their history reminds us that true, lasting power isn't just measured in the height of your monuments or the size of your army, but in the ability to live in a balanced relationship with the land that sustains you, a lesson that has never been more urgent than it is right now. Now consider the sheer distance this command had to travel. An emperor in Rome might need to order a legion on the Rhine frontier to march east to counter an incursion. That message couldn't arrive weeks later. It had to move with breathtaking speed. To solve this, empires created the world's first information superhighways. The Persian Empire under Darius I built the magnificent Royal Road, a 1,700-mile marvel of engineering stretching from the capital at Susa all the way to Sardis near the Aegean coast. But the road itself was just the stage. The stars of the show were the royal couriers. Herodotus, the Greek historian, famously wrote of these messengers, Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. They operated a relay system with fresh horses and riders waiting at way stations spaced a day's ride apart. A message could fly across the empire in just 7 days, a speed that would not be surpassed until the invention of the telegraph in the 19th century. This wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival. The ability to respond to a rebellion or an invasion before it could spread was the difference between holding an empire together and watching it splinter into pieces. This relentless flow of information created an avalanche of administrative paperwork, and that is where the true power of writing revealed itself. We often think of ancient writing in terms of epic poetry or royal chronicles, but its first and most vital use was far more mundane: accounting. In the bustling temple complexes of Sumer, scribes used a reed stylus to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets, creating the cuneiform script. Their earliest texts are not stories of gods and heroes, but dry inventory lists. 10 sheep received from the shepherd Namu, 5 jars of oil delivered to the temple storehouse. This might seem tedious, but it was revolutionary. For the first time, a ruler could know exactly how much grain was in his granaries, how many arrows were in his armories, and how much tribute was owed from a distant province. This data allowed for predictive planning, calculating how many mouths could be fed through the winter, how many soldiers could be levied for a campaign, and how much surplus could be traded. Writing transformed governance from guesswork into a science of management, creating a transparent, albeit heavily controlled, system of economic accountability that reached from the palace down to the smallest village. As these administrative needs grew more complex, so too did the written word itself. What began as simple pictographs and tallies evolved into sophisticated scripts capable of capturing the full nuance of human language. This evolution unlocked writing's potential for more than just lists. It became the vessel for law, literature, and history. A legal code like Hammurabi's could be carved into a towering black stone stele for all to see, creating a permanent, public standard of justice that was far less arbitrary than the decree of a local chieftain. Scribes began to record not just quantities of barley, but the deeds of kings, the motions of planets, and the prayers to gods. They wrote down the old oral stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the tales of Egyptian gods, preserving a cultural heritage that might otherwise have been lost. This created a new, powerful class of intellectuals, the scribes, priests, and scholars who were the guardians of this written knowledge. Their ability to read and write granted them immense influence, making them indispensable advisors to the throne and the architects of imperial ideology. Yet, with dozens of different languages spoken across a vast empire, a common tongue was needed to make this system work. This led to the rise of the lingua franca, a standardized language of administration and trade that acted as a bridge between cultures. In the Near East, it was Aramaic, its relatively simple alphabetic script spreading far and wide under the Assyrian and Persian empires because it was easier to learn than complex cuneiform. In the Mediterranean world, it was Latin. A merchant from Spain, a tax collector in North Africa, and a soldier stationed in Britain might all have spoken their own native languages at home, but for official business, to sign a contract, to receive their orders, to pay their taxes, they used Latin. This created a powerful, unifying cultural force. To be a citizen of Rome was, in part, to participate in a Latinate world of law, commerce, and literature. It didn't erase local cultures, but it laid a common linguistic floor that enabled communication, fostered a shared identity, and made the business of governing a diverse empire not just possible but efficient. Ultimately, these innovations in communication formed the central nervous system of the state, connecting the brain of the empire, the ruler and his court to its farthest limbs. A governor in a rebellious province could be recalled with a single scroll delivered by a courier. New agricultural techniques developed in the fertile heartland could be written down and sent to outlying regions to boost their productivity. Most importantly, the state's official narrative, the glory of the emperor, the benevolence of the gods who favored them, the threat of the barbarians at the gates, could be disseminated consistently to every corner of the realm through posted edicts, public readings, and official temple rituals. This constant stream of coordinated information was the true glue holding the imperial mosaic together. It allowed for a scale of cooperation and collective action that was utterly unimaginable in the world of nomadic tribes, proving that an empire's greatest strength was not just its army's might, but its ability to speak with one clear, organized, and far-reaching voice. Even the mightiest empires were not invincible fortresses. They were dynamic, living entities constantly tested by the brutal realities of the ancient world. A sudden shift in the climate could bring drought and famine, withering the agricultural surplus that fed cities and armies. A charismatic rebel could rally discontented provinces, threatening to fracture the realm from within. Or a new, powerful enemy could emerge on the frontier, wielding unfamiliar tactics that rendered the empire's once invincible legions suddenly obsolete. These were not mere inconveniences. They were existential threats that could unravel centuries of achievement in a matter of years. How an empire responded to these moments of extreme pressure, whether with flexibility and innovation or with stubborn rigidity, often determined its destiny, carving a path toward either renewal or ruin. When crisis struck, empires generally had two broad strategic paths they could take, each reflecting a different philosophy of power. One response was to decentralize, to loosen the reins of control from the capital and grant greater autonomy to regional governors and local leaders. The Roman Empire's eventual division into Eastern and Western halves under Diocletian is a classic example of this strategy. Faced with relentless pressure on multiple fronts from Germanic tribes in the north to the Sassanid Persians in the east, the empire effectively created two administrative heads, each better able to respond to local threats with speed and knowledge that a single, distant emperor could never muster. This wasn't a sign of weakness, but a pragmatic adaptation to the sheer impossibility of micromanaging a vast territory from one center. It allowed for more flexible, localized solutions without the fatal delay of waiting for orders from a capital that might be months away. The opposite approach was to double down on central control, to assert the authority of the state with even greater force and intensity. This often took the form of sweeping reforms from the top, designed to shock the system back into order. When economic collapse threatened, an emperor might recall all existing currency and reissue new, purer coins to restore faith in the monetary system. To quell rebellion, a ruler might implement harsh new laws, increase the size of the secret police, or launch brutal punitive campaigns to make an example of disloyal regions. The Qin dynasty in China, for instance, responded to the chaos of the Warring States period by imposing a breathtakingly strict legalist system from the center, standardizing everything from the width of cart axles to the written script in a massive, top-down effort to forge unity through absolute control. This strategy gambled that strength and uniformity could overwhelm any challenge. It was often at these desperate breaking points that necessity became the mother of invention, forcing empires to develop ingenious new solutions. Prolonged droughts might spur investments in more sophisticated irrigation technology or the adoption of new, drought-resistant crops imported from distant trading partners. The constant threat of invasion could lead to revolutionary military innovations. The Romans, after suffering humiliating defeats by Carthaginian cavalry, were forced to abandon their rigid phalanx formation and develop the more flexible maniple system, which would later become the backbone of their legendary legions. Sometimes the most crucial adaptation was social. Faced with labor shortages after a plague, an empire might be forced to grant greater rights to peasants or integrate conquered peoples more fully into the army and society, tapping into previously overlooked sources of strength and talent. However, the history of empires is also a graveyard of those that failed this test of adaptability, whose very success bred a fatal rigidity. Perhaps the most poignant example is the late Roman Empire's struggle against the migratory Germanic tribes. The Roman military machine, perfected over centuries, was designed to fight set-piece battles against organized armies. It was notoriously slow to adapt to the guerrilla-style hit-and-run tactics of the Goths and Vandals. Furthermore, the immense prestige of Roman tradition itself became a trap. The deeply conservative senatorial aristocracy often resisted essential reforms, clinging to the ways of the past even as the world changed around them. This institutional inertia, this inability to rethink fundamental assumptions, left them vulnerable to more agile and adaptable foes. Their collapse serves as a powerful reminder that no amount of past glory can protect a civilization that refuses to evolve. This endless dance between challenge and response reveals a profound truth about the nature of empire. The transition from nomadic life to imperial grandeur was never a single event that could be completed and then forgotten. It was an ongoing and never-ending process of negotiation. Empires were not static monuments. They were constant conversations between the center and the periphery, between tradition and innovation, between the demands of the elite and the needs of the populace. Every famine, every invasion, every rebellion forced a renegotiation of this social contract. The most resilient empires were those that listened carefully during these crises, that were willing to learn from their subjects, their enemies, and even their own mistakes. They understood that longevity was not about resisting change, but about mastering the art of adaptive integration, weaving new ideas and new people into their fabric without losing their core identity. This dynamic process of struggle and adaptation didn't just preserve empires, it fundamentally shaped them, forging the complex, resilient, and ever-evolving civilizations whose legacies still shape our world today. Yet for all the grandeur of their palaces and the rigidity of their bureaucracies, the empires that emerged from this great transition never fully erased the ghost of their nomadic past. The spirit of the open steppe, the skills honed over millennia of mobility, persisted like a cultural heartbeat beneath the stone and marble of imperial civilization, influencing everything from how they fought their wars to how they conceived of the divine. This was not a simple case of primitive traditions being swallowed by advanced culture. It was a complex, ongoing dialogue between the old way and the new, a synthesis that gave empires a surprising depth and resilience. Perhaps the most direct and obvious inheritance was in the art of war. The very empires that built immense walls to keep nomads out were often forced to adopt the tactics of those same nomadic peoples to survive. The powerful states of the Near East, from the Assyrians to the Persians, looked out at the vast Eurasian steppe and saw warriors who lived their entire lives on horseback, for whom the bow was not just a weapon but an extension of their identity. These nomadic archers could unleash a storm of arrows while riding at a full gallop, a feat of equestrian and martial skill that sedentary infantry formations could scarcely comprehend. Instead of trying to defeat this mobile warfare with sheer brute force, smart empires chose to emulate and incorporate it. They began to recruit these very horsemen as mercenaries or allied contingents, weaving them into the fabric of their own armies. The Parthians and later the Sassanid Persians built their entire military doctrine around heavily armored cavalry, the cataphracts, a concept borrowed and refined from the steppe nomads they battled. Even the mighty Romans, whose legions were the ultimate expression of infantry discipline, were repeatedly humbled by nomadic horse archers and eventually had to develop their own extensive cavalry forces to counter the threat. The empire's greatest military weakness often became its greatest strength once it learned to embrace the very traditions it sought to defend against. This cultural borrowing extended far beyond the battlefield, seeping into the very soul of imperial identity through art, story, and spirit. The nomadic world was one of animal husbandry, and their artistic vocabulary was dominated by powerful, stylized representations of the creatures that shared their lives: stags, wolves, eagles, and horses. These potent symbols did not vanish with settlement. They were translated into new mediums and contexts. The magnificent gold work of the Scythians, dripping with intricate animal combat scenes, was wildly popular in the Greek cities of the Black Sea coast, influencing Hellenistic jewelry and metalwork. Nomadic motifs of intertwined beasts, known as the animal style, traveled along trade routes, appearing on everything from Roman belt buckles to the ceremonial armor of Chinese emperors. Even the stories told around campfires found a new home. The epic tales of heroic ancestors and their journeys across mythic landscapes, once the oral history of a tribe, provided raw material for the foundational myths of settled states. The legend of Romulus and Remus, suckled by a she-wolf, reads like a classic nomadic origin story, repurposed to give the world's most formidable empire a humble, wild beginning. This wasn't a downgrading of culture, it was an enrichment, adding a layer of primal, symbolic power to the formalized state art of the palace and temple. In some of the most fascinating cases, the administrative structures of empires themselves bore the unmistakable imprint of their nomadic origins. This was especially clear in the conquest empires built by nomadic peoples themselves. When the Mongols exploded out of Central Asia to create the largest contiguous land empire in history, they did not simply destroy the complex societies they encountered and return to herding. Instead, they imposed a superbly efficient organizational system onto the conquered territories that was directly adapted from their nomadic way of life. The entire empire was divided, much like the grazing lands of a confederation of tribes, among the family of Genghis Khan. The communication network of the Yam, a series of relay stations with fresh horses that allowed messengers to ride across the empire with incredible speed, was a direct, scaled-up application of the nomadic understanding of logistics and distance. They even preserved the concept of a movable center of power. While they established capital cities like Karakoram, the heart of Mongol authority often remained the great mobile court, the Ordo, where the ruler held court from a grand tent, surrounded by the felt dwellings of his followers. This demonstrated a breathtaking flexibility. They could rule a vast, settled empire without wholly abandoning the mobile political structure that had been the source of their strength. This enduring influence challenges a simplistic narrative of linear progress from nomadic simplicity to civilized complexity. It reveals a far more interesting truth, that cultural development is not a process of replacement, but of layering. The empire did not kill the nomad. It provided a new, larger, and more permanent stage upon which nomadic skills, aesthetics, and social structures could be adapted and amplified. The cavalry charge that decided an imperial battle, the animal motif etched on a prince's dagger, the tribal council reconfigured as an imperial advisory body, all were echoes of a world without walls. This continuity provided empires with a crucial link to a different kind of knowledge, a deep understanding of mobility, animal husbandry, and the vast spaces between cities that they now sought to control. It reminds us that the most enduring and successful cultures are not those that break entirely with their past, but those that find innovative ways to carry their history forward with them, blending the wisdom of the wanderer with the ambition of the builder to create something truly resilient and new. To truly appreciate the incredible diversity of the human journey from nomadic life to complex societies, we can place two of the world's first great civilizations side by side: Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and the enigmatic cities of the Indus Valley. Their stories unfold like two different answers to the same profound question, revealing how geography, personality, and sheer human ingenuity could chart wildly different courses to civilization. Let's begin in Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was a land of incredible agricultural potential, but it was also a demanding and unpredictable environment. The rivers didn't gently water the land, they flooded violently and erratically, or sometimes not at all. This challenge sparked a culture of aggressive innovation and control. The people who settled here, the Sumerians, responded to nature's volatility by trying to master it. They became hydrological engineers on a massive scale, digging intricate networks of canals and levees to tame the rivers and water their fields. This need for large-scale, coordinated labor demanded strong, centralized leadership and social hierarchy. Someone had to organize the digging crews, allocate water rights, and store the surplus. This gave rise to a class of priest-kings who wielded both religious and political authority, operating from the spiritual and economic heart of the community, the massive stepped temple known as the ziggurat. This drive for control and administration led to one of humanity's most transformative inventions, writing. Cuneiform script began not as poetry or history, but as accounting. Temple officials needed to keep track of who had delivered how many sheep, how much grain was in the storerooms, and how much land was owed in taxes. They started pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets, and over centuries, this practical bookkeeping system evolved to record laws, literature, and royal decrees. This bureaucratic need for order is also etched into the world's first known legal codes, like that of Ur-Nammu and later the famous Code of Hammurabi, which established rules and punishments for everything from property disputes to murder. Mesopotamian society was outward-looking, competitive, and often militaristic. Their city-states like Uruk, and Lagash were in constant flux, warring with each other, rising to regional dominance under a powerful ruler like Sargon of Akkad, and then falling to the next conqueror. Their story is one of dynamic, often turbulent, growth driven by a need to impose order on a chaotic world. Now, let's travel east to the Indus Valley, a civilization that presents a fascinating and almost mirror image contrast. Here, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, another great river system, the Indus and the Ghaggar-Hakra, provided a more predictable and generous environment. The challenges were different, primarily dealing with seasonal monsoon rains and annual river flooding. The people who built the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa seem to have responded to their world not with a drive to dominate, but with a genius for elegant planning and social consensus. If Mesopotamia shouts its history from towering ziggurats and boastful royal inscriptions, the Indus Valley whispers its secrets through its breathtaking urban planning. The most striking feature of Indus cities is their meticulous, almost modern layout. They were built on a grid pattern of broad, straight streets with standardized kiln-fired bricks used throughout. This suggests a remarkable degree of central planning and a society that valued collective well-being over individual glorification. Their most astonishing achievement was a sophisticated, city-wide water management system that remains awe-inspiring today. Nearly every house had its own bathroom and toilet, with wastewater channeled into covered, centralized drains running beneath the streets. They had elaborate public baths like the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, which may have served ritual purification purposes. This obsession with cleanliness and public health is something no other contemporary civilization matched. Yet, for all their architectural brilliance, the Indus Valley civilization remains deeply mysterious because we cannot read their writing. They had a script found on thousands of small seal stones, but it remains undeciphered. Without royal annals, grand temples, or palaces that clearly identify a ruling class, we get a profound sense of a different social model. There is little evidence of monumental statues of kings, lavish royal tombs, or even obvious palaces. This has led many scholars to speculate that Indus society might have been more egalitarian, perhaps governed by a council of elders or merchant guilds rather than an all-powerful monarch. Their wealth seems to have been built on peaceful, extensive trade networks that reached Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and deep into the Indian subcontinent. Their decline is one of history's great puzzles, possibly linked to climate change that dried up rivers, shifting trade routes, or a slow breakdown of their complex social order. They didn't appear to fall to a dramatic invasion but rather faded away, their incredible cities gradually abandoned to the dust. Placing these two civilizations next to each other is illuminating. Mesopotamia shows us a path to complexity forged through competition, hierarchy, and the control of nature. Its legacy is one of kings, laws, and epic stories of power. The Indus Valley, by contrast, suggests a path built on cooperation, urban planning, and social consensus. Its legacy is one of engineering, trade, and a haunting silence. One was loud, boastful, and left a detailed paper trail of its triumphs and failures. The other was quiet, efficient, and left behind a perfectly planned city that we can walk through but cannot fully understand. Together, they prove there was no single road from nomadic life to civilization. The human spirit, when presented with different challenges and opportunities, can build a ziggurat pointing to the heavens to reach the gods, or it can build a perfect sewer system beneath the streets to improve daily life for everyone. Both are monumental achievements. Both represent the breathtaking creativity of our species as we learn to live together in ever larger numbers, each civilization writing its own unique chapter in the story of us. So we've traced the incredible journey from mobile bands to monumental empires, but this raises a deeper, more philosophical question. Why did it happen at all? Was this great transition inevitable, or was it a spectacular historical accident? Scholars have wrestled with this for generations, and their debates have given rise to several compelling theoretical perspectives, each offering a different lens through which to view this profound shift in human organization. One of the most influential schools of thought is the materialist perspective. This viewpoint argues that the fundamental drivers of change were concrete, environmental, and economic forces. Think of it as the hardware of history. Materialists point to the end of the last ice age as the ultimate catalyst. As glaciers retreated, certain regions, particularly the Fertile Crescent, became hotspots of wild, cultivable grains and animals ideal for domestication. This natural abundance created an opportunity, but it was the development of key technologies, the plow for turning soil, irrigation for controlling water, and metallurgy for creating better tools, that allowed societies to seize that opportunity. The materialist argument is powerfully simple. The ability to produce a food surplus changed everything. This surplus allowed for population growth, which required more complex social organization, which in turn led to specialization, trade, and the accumulation of wealth. From this perspective, empire wasn't a choice. It was the logical, almost mechanical outcome of a new economic reality. The pyramid was built because there was suddenly enough extra food to feed the thousands of laborers who weren't farming. But other scholars find this explanation too sterile. They argue that human beings are not just economic actors, we are meaning makers. This is where ideational theories come into play, focusing on the software of culture, the beliefs, symbols, and worldviews that motivate people. This perspective suggests that the transition required a revolution in human consciousness before it could manifest in stone and mortar. The move to settled life and eventually empire demanded a new way of seeing the world and humanity's place within it. It required the development of religious ideologies that could justify hierarchy and centralize power. The idea of a divine king, a ruler chosen by or incarnating the gods, was not just a nifty political trick. It was a psychological breakthrough that convinced people to obey a distant authority and contribute to colossal projects that served the state. Shared myths, public rituals, and grand artistic styles created a sense of collective identity that could override older, local tribal loyalties. For ideational theorists, the ziggurat and the pyramid are not just byproducts of an agricultural surplus. They are the physical manifestations of a new, unifying belief system that made empire imaginable and desirable. Then there is the more confrontational view offered by conflict theory. This lens sees history not as a process of peaceful innovation or ideological shift, but as a story of competition, coercion, and warfare. From this angle, the transition was driven by the constant pressure of us versus them. As early villages grew and resources became more valuable, competition between groups intensified. The groups that developed more effective military organization, whether through better weapons, disciplined infantry, or skilled charioteers, gained a decisive advantage. Conquest became a self-fueling engine. Winning a war provided loot, slaves, and new lands, which increased the power of the victorious chief or king. This new wealth allowed them to support a larger, more professional army, which then enabled further conquest. Conflict theorists argue that the state, with its monopolies on violence and taxation, emerged essentially as a permanent garrison to protect the wealth of the winners and control the labor of the losers. Empire, in this view, is not a cooperative social contract but organized predation on a grand scale, its centralization forged in the furnace of perpetual war. Most contemporary historians, however, resist favoring any single explanation. Instead, they embrace a complex systems approach which sees the transition as an emergent property. This is the view that our story is the result of countless interconnected factors: environmental, technological, economic, ideological, and military, feeding back on each other in unpredictable ways. Imagine a feedback loop. A slight climate shift allows for early cultivation, which leads to a small surplus. That surplus supports a part-time shaman or chief, whose ability to organize people leads to a more efficient irrigation system, which creates a larger surplus. The larger surplus supports a bigger population, which requires more formal rules to prevent conflict, which strengthens the chief's power. His increased power allows for military expansion, which brings in more resources and people, which requires even more complex administration, and so on. No single factor started the loop or controls it entirely. Each development creates the conditions for the next. The emergence of empire becomes a kind of threshold effect in human social organization, a point of no return where the complexity of the system tips over into a new, stable state that is incredibly difficult to reverse. This perspective doesn't just combine the other theories, it shows how they were inextricably linked, each acting as both a cause and an effect in a vast, unfolding historical process. It reminds us that we are not just telling a simple story of progress, but but mapping the intricate and often unpredictable pathways of human adaptation. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, standing amidst the echoing halls of history, looking back at the immense path we've traveled. From the whispering winds of the open steppe to the bustling, sun-baked plazas of the first great cities, this was not a simple, straightforward march of progress. It was a complex, messy, and utterly human story of adaptation. Our ancestors didn't set out with a grand blueprint to build empires. They were simply responding, generation after generation, to a changing world. They made a series of choices, some deliberate and some born of desperation, that collectively steered humanity onto a new course. They traded the intimate, precarious freedom of the hunter-gatherer for the structured, predictable security of the farmer, and in doing so, they set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the pharaoh in his palace and the legionnaire on his march. This transition was forged in the crucible of climate change, fueled by breathtaking ingenuity and cemented by a new willingness to cooperate, and sometimes to conquer, on a scale never before imagined. The echoes of this ancient shift are not confined to history books. They resonate in the very bedrock of our modern lives. Every time we walk down a city street laid out in a grid, we are walking in the footsteps of the urban planners of Mohenjo-Daro. When we engage with a legal system based on written statutes and codes, we are participating in a tradition that began with Hammurabi's chisel striking stone. Our global economy, with its complex trade networks and standardized currencies, is a direct descendant of those first merchants carrying obsidian and spices between ancient kingdoms. Even our ongoing struggle to balance economic growth with environmental sustainability is a modern chapter in an age-old story that began when the first fields were cleared and the first irrigation canals were dug. The challenges of social inequality, the quest for collective identity, and the tension between individual freedom and communal responsibility are all themes that were written into the human experience during this pivotal transition. We are still living in the world that the end of nomadism built, navigating the opportunities and the dilemmas that come with a settled, monumental existence. This brings us to a final, reflective thought. The story from nomads to empire is often told as one of unequivocal advancement, a triumphant ascent from simplicity to complexity. But was it truly a straight upgrade in the human experience? It's a question worth holding in your mind. The nomadic life offered a deep, experiential connection to the natural world and a form of social egalitarianism that would become much rarer. The imperial world, in contrast, gave us art, architecture, science, and law, but it also gave us rigid social hierarchies, widespread slavery, and large-scale warfare. This wasn't a simple trade of bad for good. It was a series of trade-offs where humanity gained certain profound capabilities at the cost of others. There is no going back, of course, but understanding this complexity allows us to look at our own civilization not as an inevitable endpoint, but as one possible outcome. It grants us the perspective to appreciate the incredible achievements of our ancestors while also critically examining the structures they created, recognizing that the same ambition that builds a temple can also forge a chain. As this chapter closes, the conversation is just beginning. We want to hear your thoughts. How do you see the legacy of this great transition playing out in your own community? Do you think the trade was worth it? What lessons from our nomadic past might we need to rediscover today? Share your reflections in the comments below. We read every single one. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the forces that shaped humanity, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the mysteries of our past. Thank you for your time and your curiosity. Until next time,